And I then, after EAG, flew to the US, and I'm getting to spend the next 2 weeks with my family. And so we're all here piloted at my grandma's house. It's sort of a comedy of errors with 2 dogs and a cat and multiple people. And so it's kind of a fun event to all be together. How about you, Sam?
Sam.
Hello. Yes, I'm well, thank you. And this week I went for my first walk in the Peak District on Easter Monday, and I just really liked nature, and it looked a little bit like back home in Switzerland, except there was no Alps in the background, but it was still really nice.
Fantastic. I love Switzerland. But yes, I haven't been there in a long while. And so where are you both located now, and how are you staying busy from your day to day? Do you want to go first, Sam?
Yeah, so I'm in Sheffield in England, and I, as mentioned, I'm a research analyst for Happier Lives Institute. So I spend my day extracting, analyzing data about interventions that could improve well-being, especially in the developing world. And I don't do that alone. I do that also with Joelle Maguire, who's the other researcher at the Happier Lives Institute. And it's good fun. And I think we do important work because the Happier Lives Institute has done a lot of thinking about what is doing good and what is good and how can we do good. Yeah, so that's a nice way of spending my day.
Yeah, and so I'll jump in, kind of as you highlighted, I split my time between working with the Happier Lives Institute as their operations manager, which I've been doing for about 9 months. And I'm also fairly new to effective altruism and have really just been enjoyed kind of diving in. And then the other half of my time, I am working on creating a new mental health program in Latin America, where I'm based in my day-to-day, Quito, which is 3,000 meters up high in the mountains. And so Vida Plena, which means a flourishing life in Spanish, is dedicated to providing mental health care to low-income and marginalized populations, starting in Ecuador, and then with the goal of expanding throughout Latin America.
I'm sure your lives have kept you pretty busy then.
Yeah.
So, well, actually, there is a question on Slido at JD post. Why do you choose to work in mental health and well-being in particular? And is there something particularly compelling about this area that you guys wanted to share with us as well? Maybe Joy?
Sure. So I'll just explain a little bit about my background. So like it was mentioned in the intro, I spent 14 years working in international development, community development throughout Latin America, and then the past 10 years in Ecuador. And so I went to Ecuador to run a fair trade company, which specifically was working with indigenous women who made handmade jewelry. And so that involved a lot of hours sitting around kitchen tables, stringing beads together. And naturally what comes out of that is just a really time to be able to get to know people's lives and hear a lot of their stories and the struggles that they're facing. And I think a lot of times in high income countries, we have this perception that mental health and depression specifically is sort of a rich person disease. However, that is the type of thing that it's not actually the case. So the Pan American Health Organization plus the statistics for depression equal numbers in Ecuador, Latin America as the US. And so, which kind of makes sense intuitively. Depression is somewhat of a genetic based disorder, and then also triggered by life circumstances. And so unemployment being one of the larger triggering factors, and there's high levels of unemployment. And so that kind of just like putting those pieces together is sort of how I kind of got interested in that. Also, my background is in nonprofit management and social work. So kind of just like all the pieces kind of coalesce together. And I always like to say, since this is like specifically EA for Christians, I really feel that it is God kind of bringing together different pieces of my life and opening up the right path. And so in the moment, a lot of different things that I wouldn't have seen and wouldn't have understood how they've come together. But now as you kind of look back, it's a lot more apparent as to this is kind of God guiding these pieces. And so I don't know that I initially set out to be like, okay, I'm going to work in mental health, but it feels like these are the right doors that have been opening up. So yeah, so just kind of a mixture of like seeing the need and then really just feeling God's guidance.
Lovely. And how about you, Sam? Was it quite similar where you're seeing God's guidance step by step?
Actually, I don't know how similar it is or not, but I can tell you how it is. I have been interested in exploring God's creation from a scientific perspective, especially how humans function. And I've done that by doing a BSc in psychology, a master's in cognitive science. But I've also been concerned with doing good as a Christian and through joining groups like Just Love and Effective Altruism. So I had been doing some thinking about, I want to use my research skills and I want to do research and I want to do something that interests me. I also want to have an impact. And during the time where I was doing this thinking, the Happier Lives Institute were recruiting research analysts, and I applied and I got the job, which is great. And what's exciting with the Happier Lives is that they've done a lot of thinking about what is good. And when you think about good, not just in terms of increasing income or health, but actually looking at people's well-being and evaluating things by trying to measure people's well-being most directly. So asking people how happy they are, how satisfied they are with their lives. Not only we think this is a better measure, but when you use these sorts of measures, you discover new important cause areas that you should prioritize, and you discover new cost-effective things. And although I started with psychology, it's kind of, I've come back to psychology, wanted to doing impact, discovering that, mental health is really important. It has an enormous impact on people's well-being. It's one of the biggest predictors of people's well-being. And I can do research about things to improve mental health. I can through this job, and that's really interesting.
Fabulous. Thanks both for sharing. I think it's just really interesting to know actually how your journey has kind of evolved as you go along with your fields of work. So Sam, tell us a little bit more about your research at the Happier Lives Institute. What are the examples of some important things that you've discovered, and why is it important?
Yes, so as I was saying, when you with our research, what we do is we look at data where people have been directly asked, how happy are you, or how satisfied are you with your life? How many of these positive or negative emotions have you been feeling? And when we use this sort of data as our outcome, as something that's good, we see that things like mental health are quite important. So what we've been doing is looking at cost-effective interventions to improve mental health. So we've been looking at psychotherapy in the developing world, more specifically also at charities like Strong Minds, who provide group interpersonal therapy in Uganda. And when we look at these, we find that they're quite cost-effective. Their model is not too costly to deliver. It has a big impact on people's lives. As I was saying, mental health, enormous impact on well-being, but also low mental health isn't something people adapt to easily. And you can't always just fix mental health by improving people's material circumstances. So psychotherapy is really cost effective, and we've actually compared Strong Minds to Give Directly, which is a kind of gold standard in effective altruism, which delivers cash transfers to people. And we find that psychotherapy is 9 to 10 times more cost effective than Give Directly. So if you're thinking about donations and redirecting resources, it seems like charities like Strong Minds are really valuable. What's exciting with my recent research is that we've not only been looking at how much effect does psychotherapy have on the individual that receives it, but also on other individuals in the household. There's not a lot of data on this, but we estimate that indeed psychotherapy has a big impact on the household. And if you have a big enough household, it seems like almost more of the impact is happening on improving the well-being of people in the household. But there's very little data on this. So if you're in research, this is an important gap in the literature to look at, measuring the effect that your intervention has not only on the individual, but also other people in the household or linked to that person. Because otherwise we're missing out on measuring a lot of the good interventions that are happening.
Yeah, and Sam, what would you say is a key challenge for measuring this at household level?
That's a really good question. I mean, it always costs more money to survey people, and I think it is a big task to run these big studies and surveys in different countries, and I don't know how it is on the ground, but I can see from the lack of data that I have to analyze that. It's complicated. But also probably just that also telling researchers know it's important to measure people's subjective well-being. It's important to measure it not just for the individual, but more people. I think just that researchers know that as something we can work out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing that. So on to you, Joy. So we have just heard about Vida Plena very briefly in our introduction, but could you tell us more about that and also its history?
Yeah, certainly. So like I mentioned, I had been working in fair trade for a number of years, and I was thinking about kind of a new career shift. I was looking for, this is before I even found EA. I wanted to find something like felt more impactful, able to reach more people. And ironically, or not ironically, but I stumbled upon a Facebook post about a similar organization out of Zimbabwe, which is called the Friendship Bench. Some people might be familiar. And what really made me excited about their program model was that they had about 10 years of solid peer-reviewed published studies, RTCs, demonstrating the actual impact of the program. And so having worked in community development and national development work for a number of years, I think there's a lot of good intentions, a lot of good programs out there, but there's very little hard evidence that really demonstrates the impact. And just one of my really strong values of working directly with people is really truly understanding that people who are struggling in poverty, their lives are already complicated. And so I don't want to come to somebody and offer them false hope with a program, especially somebody who's dealing with mental health problems, offer them some sort of false hope that I'm not certain about. And so I was really excited about this kind of the evidence as I started to read a number of the different studies. And there's a couple of organizations, like Sam mentioned, Strong Minds is operating at scale in Uganda, but there's not really anyone doing that at scale in Latin America yet. And so that felt like something that was like really important and really necessary that I could bring to the people that I cared about and to this continent that I've really come to love and care about. And so what's also particularly interesting about this model is that it works with non-specialists. So you take local people from the community and you train them. They don't have to have any previous mental health experience. They don't even have to have a high school degree. And they receive a very intensive training. And then they receive ongoing kind of like supervision, but then they run therapy groups in their local communities. And so it's very much a model that is focused on empowering local people to be able to take control of their own mental health and to be able to have the resources necessary. I also really like the model that it's working off of groups. And so it's building connections within the communities. So that way, not only to be able to improve people's mental health in the short term, but to really be able to build strong connections. So Strong Minds found in their experience that, well, first off, just going back to the evidence, 85% of people after going through the program, and it's specifically about a 9-week program, 85% of people have significant improvement in their depression symptoms. And then they went back and they check in on people 6 months later, and still about 75% of people report having a significant improvement. So this is really exciting data. The fact that this is not just like the idea that we can do something, we have data to be able to demonstrate there is an evidence-based program available. And so right now what I'm doing for Vida Plena is I am creating a pilot, which will be running this summer. We're going to be training the first cohort of community group facilitators, about 10 people, with the idea of reaching 100 beneficiaries. And I'm doing that with Columbia University out in New York, who is the original team of mental health experts that trained Strong Minds. So I feel really excited that we're working with the people who helped create the program model to be certain that we are also setting up a similar program model that is absolutely kind of following the right steps. We are certain about that we're creating a program that will have the right impact. And so that's kind of where we're at now. So it's an exciting place of like starting to really set up the pieces. I just brought on the first 2 team members, and we're going to be starting supervisor training starting next week. So that's where we're at in terms of the program growth. And so hopefully at next year's conference, I'll be able to come back to you with a published study, being able to talk about how we have adapted the program to Latin America, what types of cultural adaptations were necessary, and then be able to share with you the results that we found. So.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joy. We'll all be very excited to hear about it for sure. So I think coming up next is really the angle on Christianity and how that really impacts your idea of well-being. I was wondering whether you guys should share a bit more from your lines of work, how Christianity has influenced your thoughts or your work itself at all. So Sam, maybe you first.
Yes, so I think we really want to assert here that in all these domains, it's really important to bring our faith to it. And ultimately, the goal isn't effective altruism, but Christ. So we want to bring all of this under his glory. And I'm only at the beginning of my thinking here, so I'm really interested to chat with people about it. But I think that what the Happier Lives Institute has been doing about thinking carefully about how do we define good and how do we measure it and what does that tell us, I think this is something Christians can engage with. And when we think about, well, what is good? What do we believe is good? What do we think is well-being for humans? We want to look at the person who ultimately defines all of this, is God, and what he has to say about it. I think if we look at well-being for humans, it seems like God does care about our happiness, our ability to enjoy his creation in a world without suffering. If you look at the promise of new creation, about the values of taking care for each other in the here and now. But we know that this isn't completely acquired here because of the influence of sin. We also know that we're called to carry our cross, that Jesus predicted we will suffer. But above this kind of happiness or kind of human experience of well-being, I think we value other things as well. So when we think about people becoming Christians in areas where they're persecuted, or where becoming a Christian might cause a lot of suffering for them and might lead happiness, like their human experience of happiness, to crumble, we would still probably think, well, it's better ultimately for them to be Christians because we value people being restored into relationship with their creator who loves them. So we value things above that as Christians, I think. And if we take a step back and think about good generally, it's possible to imagine that God gives intrinsic value to things outside of the human experience, maybe intrinsic value to life or justice or other things. So as I mentioned, I'm at the beginning of my thinking on this. I'm really interested in talking with people, but I want to make the slightly bold claim that this is probably one of the most important areas of thinking for Christians in effective altruism, and that it's going to permeate all our conversations, whether it be about AI, animal welfare, global development. We want to know what we think is good, to be able to talk about it and discuss it.
Fantastic. And how about you, Joy?
Yeah. So I have long felt very compelled by the teachings that are found in the Bible, specifically Christ, of caring for the poor. One of the most striking parables is the story of the parable of the sheep and the goats. And I think we sometimes gloss it over. We don't like to think about what it could actually imply, is when Christ says, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And then on the flip side is, whatever you didn't do for the least of these, you didn't do for me. There's really quite a harsh condemnation there. And I think that as Christians, we really need to think about how do we actually put that in practice in all areas of our lives. And so that's something I have wrestled with a fair amount. I think a lot of people who are working unless you're working in an expressly Christian organization, we find ourselves in very secular environments, which are not very friendly to Christians. And so it's, how do you live that out? And as I've been creating Vida Plena, it's something I've had to think about as well, is, do I make this an explicitly Christian organization? Do I just kind of follow more of like the secular path and really just kind of focus on helping people? And I think somewhat where I've landed is this desire to have the organization resting on the fundamentals of Christianity, which is this idea of love and service for one another, and having that being based out of a place of our relationship and love from God. And so having that reflected in sort of the structures and how the organization is set up and the principles that it's based upon. Um, it's a challenge going forward, but I see myself absolutely as a gardener, and this is very much like in all aspects of all things we're doing as Christians. If we put it in God's hands, it's really ultimately up to Him whether it's to grow or flourish. And so I see myself as it's my responsibility to plant the seeds and pull up the weeds and till the earth, but I can't be the one to ultimately force the seeds to sprout or for the sun to shine and make them grow. And so it's ultimately in God's hands how our work is to come about. And so it's a little bit of a roundabout question, but I think ultimately what it comes down to is seeking to live out our Christian values in loving one another.
Yes, thanks for sharing. Love that analogy. I think it's going to stay in my head for a bit. I think we're now going to move on to Slido because we've got some fantastic questions there from Anonymous. But how do you avoid white saviorism in your work? And relatedly, how do you engage with different cultural understandings of mental health and well-being? So Joy and Sam, see who would like to take that first.
Sure. I imagine that's somewhat directed towards me because Sam's a little bit more in a research position, but interested to hear your thoughts too. I think that is absolutely a very valid question. And what I think the way I work on that is by coming in as a partnership model. And so I am working with a team, like I mentioned, I'm working with 2 local Ecuadorian psychologists, and I'm also working with a local partner organization who is based in Ecuador and fully run by Ecuadorians. And so very much like deferring to them in the critical aspects of how do we build the structures for this organization and working off of their knowledge. So really what I see it as is my role is to be able to introduce new tools and skills and also to help bring some of the resources that are needed, but really to rely on them. And again, the whole program is built on this model of community empowerment. And so really taking the strengths of these communities that already exist and facilitating them to be able to have the spaces to be able to apply them. So I think kind of having that mentality of like, my job is to come alongside of people who are already doing amazing things and just to be able to provide sort of an additional level of tools that they're able to use.
Thank you, Joy. Sam, would you like to add to
that? Honestly, I think this is a great question, and I don't think I have anything to answer that. I'm a bit distant from it, but I understand that it's something I also have to think about, someone in research.
Sure, no worries. Let's move on to maybe a couple more questions then. So there is a question around whether there's a gap or unmet need in each community regarding mental health and well-being. What are your thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So is there a gap or unmet need in each community regarding mental health and well-being?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. I think there's been a lot of conversation in EA recently that's focused on how do we build mental health and well-being programs in. I don't know specifically, not as specifically to each, but just in EA in general. And I know there's a number of people who are interested in creating those programs and a number of coaches who are specifically focusing on EAs. I think each does a good job of continuing to bring in that Christian aspect and importance of reflecting on spirituality and how that plays into it. I would say though, I would like to really encourage everybody not to, I think there can be a tendency, this is something we've been talking about in HLI very recently, of a little bit very much keeping like the health and the mental health and wellness kind of focused on oneself. And clearly that's important. We want to be able to function, but I want to just remind everyone that again, mental health is not a problem specifically for us in the developed world. This is a problem that's universal. And if we're able to kind of think about how are we able to extend outside of our own initial kind of borders and looking at who are the other people around us. Statistically, if you take into account all of the mental health disorders, such as dementia and developmental disorders, at least 1 in 10 people will face a mental health disorder in their life. So it's very clear that there's likely somebody in your life right now that you can pause and think of who is facing some sort of mental health problem. And so how do we, rather than keeping the resources focused inward, how do we extend outward and think about how do we actually continue to serve people around us?
Thank you. And Sam, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think I haven't done a survey of people in each and their mental health, but I completely agree with what Joy has said. And to turn the question a bit around, recently there was a report on philanthropy, and I think it's less than 1% that's going to mental health. So maybe the gap is also is there, and that it is a neglected area.
Great, thank you for answering that. I think we'll probably end with just a very quick question. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to anyone who's, ready to go into the mental health field or career related to it, what would it be? Maybe a 1-sentence advice, if possible.
Go to our website at Work With Us. And I'm saying this jokingly, but really there's a section, if you scroll down a little bit, where it says, well, if you're in this domain or this domain, like if you're someone interested in organizations about joining, improving, creating, if you're someone in research about thinking about what are the gaps, what are the questions, if you're someone interested in donating, looking into charities like Strong Minds or Vida, Plena, and get in contact with people like Joy, myself, Barry Grimes, or anyone else at Happier Lives Institute.
Fabulous.
Yeah, sure. And my 1-sentence piece of advice would be, there's a lot of great resources out there where you can start to learn a lot of the concepts. If you're looking at cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of you can self-teach as a baseline, and it's the type of thing that, going back, although it is like self-reflective, can be very helpful for yourself also, and just like the conversations with your immediate friends and your friend group, and kind of, I find that a lot of times they're exceptionally valuable. And then from there, in terms of like actually building a career, would be to look at the different, I think there's often a focus on becoming, say, a psychologist, but I think there's a lot of different pieces to mental health. And so taking the time to explore a little bit and not just going down one path, but exploring your different options.
Great, thank you so much, Sam and Joy. It's been a pleasure to have you both here. And I think we're now close to the end of our session. So I think the next session here will be the keynote webinar with Bruce. But again, everyone here, thank you for attending this talk. And a big round of applause for Sam and Joy for joining us today again.
Yeah,
please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to. I'm sure they'll be up for one-to-ones and myself as well.
I also put my email in the chat box, and so I'd really be happy to talk with anyone. Feel free to drop me an email. So thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you. See you, everyone.